This episode is brought to you by the continuing education courses in the Neurodiversity University. From individual study at home access to a district-wide program for all your educators, the courses from Emily Kircher-Morris can be used to fulfill CE requirements. Go to neurodiversity.university or click the link in the show notes for more information.
It's important not to save your kid from every mistake. We have to let our kids be part of creating the process, because the process I might create might be totally different from how my child organizes or categorizes, say, their materials or their time.
As we grow from kids to adults, the way we manage life's ups and downs is hugely impacted by our executive functioning skills, especially for those who are neurodivergent. How do those skills change with each stage of life? And what effect do they really have on everyday challenges? Today, I'm chatting with Jane Singleton, an educator, certified coach, and founder of Launchpad for Life. Jane's going to help us unpack the journey of developing these critical skills, how to strike the right balance in supporting our kids without holding them back, and how parents and educators can better team up for the success of neurodivergent students. That's all coming up on episode 222. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity? You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity Podcast.
If you're in the field of education, I have a quick favor to ask. My next book, written with my co-author and good friend Amanda Morin, is going to be out in January 2025. It's called Neurodiversity Affirming Schools, Transforming Practices so all students feel accepted and supported. We're really excited about it and can't wait to get it in your hands. But while we're waiting for the release date to arrive, we're busy planning all of the exciting things that will go along with it. And that includes professional development courses that will be available both virtually and in person. Here's where the request comes in. It would be awesome if you could take just a couple of minutes and head over to the show notes to complete the Professional Learning Interest Survey. It'll help guide our efforts to make sure that what we create is what you most want and need. The survey should only take a couple of minutes, and we'd be so grateful for your help. Okay, Jane Singleton is here next.
Previously on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
With kids, particularly where behavior is, bumpy, I'll call it that. I think there's so much parental energy, and how do we control the kids' behavior? When, of course, our goal is really how do we help them develop self-control? The challenge, of course, is it tends to be messy before it's less messy. What's interesting for me is the rage quitting or, the anxious avoidance. I mean, all of these things are stress systems that are overwhelmed. And when as a parent, as a teacher or administrator, whatever, go in and try to start controlling kids, by definition, I'm increasing their stress, because I'm decreasing their healthy sense of control.
That's episode 206. Find it wherever you get your podcasts.
Today, I'm talking to Jane Singleton. Jane is an educator and certified coach who supports neurodivergent people and is the founder of Launchpad for Life. So, Jane, thank you so much for talking to me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Emily.
You work with a lot of your clients on building executive functioning skills. And one of the things that you've really noticed is how executive functioning develops through various life stages. So to start off our conversation, I'd really love to hear what you notice about that trajectory and how a person's executive functioning skills impacts those life stages.
Of course. I think what's important to remember here when we talk about executive functioning is that the demands on executive functioning naturally increase with the level of independence required at every life stage. So there's what we might consider more low-risk executive functioning demands, meaning I forgot to turn in my homework, I don't know how to manage my time with extracurriculars and homework and chores. But as you get older, all of a sudden you're in charge of everything. So right from elementary to middle, but then in high school, you up the ante with grades, and that might impact your chances for where you go to school, and there's more competition. And then I think the transition into the career world where you're completely independent from having to manage things financially on your own, how you make decisions. This, to me, is the key thing I work on with my clients, because how you make decisions requires a lot of executive functioning. You have to plan ahead. You have to think of what many people call the domino effect of every decision. And the weight of that is so much bigger, which is why it's so essential we kind of build in practicing those executive functioning skills at younger ages. Because imagine if you didn't have that practice and then all of a sudden you're an adult and you have bills, rent, work, grocery shopping. Like, I think if we can all think back to our early 20s, that transition alone is a pretty hard one.
Mm-hmm. I feel like for many of us, college is kind of like this halfway house to adulthood where you have a decent amount of independence, but not like full independence. But you're right. It is something, and it can kind of be a rude awakening, I think, as we go through those stages. And like you mentioned, it's important for people when they're younger to experience some of that independence so that they can really build that skill.
I also think, too, one thing that gets left out of the conversation with executive functioning is that self-monitoring and self-regulation, because that deeply impacts social skills. And when we think about professional communication and being aware of our own emotions and how we react, and taking that pause of how a reaction in particular might impact relationship, that again carries more weight, I think, in the career world. And so we need to chip away at that early as well.
You know, I often like to point out that the reason executive functioning skills are called skills is because they are something that can be taught and learned. Even though exactly how those skills are implemented and exactly what timeline they develop, it might be unique for each person, but they really are skills that can be developed. For parents of neurodivergent young people, if they're really working on building executive functioning skills with their child, because it's impacting them just on a day-to-day basis, they're probably trying to figure out, like, what do I do? How do I help my child build these skills? So what approach do you take to encourage parents to help their kids build those skills?
I think the first thing you have to be aware of is it's important not to save your kid from every mistake. We have to let our kids be part of creating the process, because the process I might create might be totally different from how my child organizes or categorizes, say, their materials or their time. And so I think it's really important to engage in asking questions, even when you know the answer. And I think as adults, sometimes we want to be helpful, and in the end, we end up telling, and then we're not letting our kids engage in problem solving, which is definitely part of an executive functioning skill. So going back to my coaching training is, even if you know the answer, how can you pause and say, well, what do we have to consider before we go camping? What do we need to consider before we pack up? It's Sunday night. What do you have going on this week? So I'm big on trying to have families schedule almost like family meetings when they actually have the time, because I do think it's the time crunch with parents of, I have to get out the door, and it's not, that's when we're going to do things, right? Because it impacts us personally or professionally. And we need to create space intentionally for planning, for working on executive functioning skills, when both the parent and the child are not in a rush and aren't trying to do other things, or their mind is not in other places.
I can relate to that in my own life, where at some point there's just this pressure, like, okay, now we have a timeline. We have to get this thing done. I'm going to tell you what to do because we just need to check the boxes and get it done. So trying to build in a little bit of time in advance in order to then be able to transition and transfer some of that accountability over to the child and have them engage in that problem-solving process can be really helpful in not only just building the executive functioning skill, but also helping them have some accountability for whatever it is that they need to be doing.
That accountability piece, I do think check-ins are necessary, right? Everyone's human. Adults make mistakes, as do kids. So checking in about follow-through, that just because you make a plan doesn't mean the follow-through happened. And so a question I like to ask, what about the process didn't work? What support do you need for it to work? Do we need to switch the plan, or is it that you need a reminder, or do we need to set a phone alarm? What is needed to be more successful next week, for example? And I also think, too, it's not just the accountability piece. I think kids build self-esteem from being accountable and successful when they do things independently. And I think sometimes when we swoop in to save them, we steal their self-esteem a little bit. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is can become a slow development of learned helplessness. And I completely do not think the intention is negative from parents at all. It's not malintended. It's meant to be helpful. But going back to just like your physical muscles, you have to let your children exercise those executive functioning muscles, even if it doesn't always work out.
I'm curious, do you ever work with parents who have their own executive functioning challenges? And how do you, the apple often doesn't fall far from the tree, let's be honest here. So, how do you navigate that? How do you help parents help their kids with executive functioning skills when maybe it's something that they both need support with?
This is such an excellent question, because I can't tell you how many times I've worked with a kid that's newly diagnosed and the parent tells me, I think I have this too, or I think this is what's going on with me. I think it can be a beautiful thing for a parent and child to work on the same skills together, obviously at different levels, but it's really helpful modeling to a kid to say, oh, my parent has difficulty with this, because kids tend to think parents have everything together. And I do a lot of sometimes family triage when I work together too. The beauty of coaching, I think, is the questioning techniques to help you figure out what's not working for that individual family. And a parent's individual needs are just as important as the child. So I never come in hot, giving advice, giving a long list of recommendations. I'm always like, well, what is manageable for you as a parent? Don't create an accountability system for your kid that you can't keep up with. No one feels good when they set themselves up for failure. And everything kind of goes back to those SMART goals that are specific and measurable and reachable and time-oriented. And so I try to always just create a safe space with the families I work with so that they can say what is manageable. I think that's very individualized.
The act of being a parent causes so much self-reflection, because I think you see the world through your child's eyes in a lot of ways. Not only does it bring those struggles to the surface, but I think there's also this aspect of kind of reprocessing whatever it was that we went through as children on our own that then also is there. So for example, if they frequently got in trouble a lot for poor executive functioning skills, perhaps they've figured out some skills now, but their instinct might be to protect or to hold their kids to really high standards because they don't want them to have that same experience. And so there's got to be some self-reflection there on the parent side too, to figure out what are the systems that we can put in place that not only work for my kid, but also work for me, as a family system. How does it all come together?
Yes, I think that self-reflection piece is so important, because I have worked with a number of parents who maybe didn't have such a great school experience. And that, I think, sometimes that can create some defensiveness and impact school-home communication. We have to acknowledge that we have come so far in terms of the research of teaching and learning, and even how we approach support and intervention when it comes to helping neurodiverse kids in the classroom. But that doesn't mean that if a parent went through the system and it was a bad experience, it's hard not to carry that with you. And so I think that's, again, creating that kind of safe space for sharing is helpful, because some of the most powerful conversations I've had with parents are when they share their own stories related to that, and then they're aware, and that goes back to kind of that emotional regulation and being able to kind of let that piece go and let it be a fresh start with the intervention as it relates to their child.
Hey there, if you're an educator looking to create a more inclusive classroom, You should check out the courses at Neurodiversity University. The courses are all led by Emily Kircher-Morris, and they're packed with videos, handouts, and quizzes to help you better educate neurodivergent students, and students of all neurotypes, really. You can choose from a number of modules dealing with topics like learning how to support dyslexic students, nurturing gifted or twice exceptional kids, or helping autistic and ADHD learners thrive. There's even a course on using AI and fan communities to build coping strategies. These courses are great for professional development or to fulfill your continuing ed requirements. And parents, you can use them to better understand how teachers are accommodating your kids' needs and get some ideas to advocate from a stronger position. The university is part of the Neurodiversity Alliance, just like our podcast. So now you know, all that's left to do is head to the link in the description and check it all out. Let's make classrooms work better for every kind of learner.
You kind of touched on this topic a little bit already, but I want to dive into it a little bit more, recognizing that there's this fine line between supporting our kids and protecting them from discomfort and the tipping point where this really does become too much. And we end up actually preventing them from experiencing the hardships and difficulties that are not only beneficial, but necessary for that growth. I'm curious about how you help parents and educators find that tipping point and reframe that struggle or even failure for their kids as a necessary tool for progress.
I think for me, I always start with what is the baseline? Where is the child's baseline in terms of emotional maturity, in terms of reaction, right? You have the shutdown or the flight freeze. And so where are they emotionally in terms of how do they take feedback, for example? And also, it's essential for all of us from a self-esteem and motivation perspective to find success. So have we created something we know that they can achieve? Because when we might want them to be in a certain place, but we have to know where they're starting from. So I always come back to that. I do a lot of backwards planning. I think backwards planning is probably my most successful strategy. That looks different when I'm looking at, like, say, a career transition or a big major life transition versus a grade shift. But the idea is like, where's the skill set we need to be meeting or successful at this particular life stage? And where are we now? And what are the baby steps that will get us to where we want to go? Because I do think it's so essential to celebrate small wins. And that's often what a lot of my young adults clients tell me about their parents is like, I just wish at some point it could get appreciated that, yes, this didn't work out, but I also did this and there have been some small shifts. And I think going back to praise and acknowledgement and taking some time to listen to what that individual is proud of is really important. So I'm big, whether you're a student or a young adult doing a career transition, it's so important that we ask, what are you proud of? And if you're starting from a place where that individual can't name anything that they're proud of, then you need to meet them there. And we need to be creating something where they can find success. And that's where I feel like progress monitoring is so important. And I do not mean that in the grade sense, like semester grades or term grades. I think this is more in stamina, where, like, how can they reflect on small things where there is progress? There's always learning and growth. And sometimes the evaluation system doesn't show that. Our traditional or standardized evaluation system doesn't always show those small wins. And so it's important that you create some sort of system where they can reflect and they're creating a system where they can monitor their own progress.
You gave the example of kids who are sharing with you that their parents aren't noticing some of those small steps. And it made me think about the fact that sometimes I almost see the reverse, especially for kids who are very high achieving or they're perfectionists or whatever, where they're the ones who don't see that progress. But I feel like the strategy that you're talking about that progress monitoring is good either way. It's good for, because it does help bring those things to the surface and facilitate those conversations about, here is the progress that you're making. So not only does it help to build some of that momentum, but it also helps them to notice, like, yes, I am making some progress. And even though my goal might be really far away, I don't have to be there right now.
And I'm glad you mentioned the perfectionism. I've worked with a lot of I like to say individuals who have demonstrated characteristics of perfectionism, it often is highly correlated with anxiety, and I do think self-esteem to some extent. But going back to that progress monitoring, you're just monitoring a different goal. Were you able to walk away from this assignment, after an hour and say, this is good enough, right? Are you able to transition? Because often in the case of a perfectionist, it's still bad time management and delegation. And we see this in the workplace too. It's like you can't really become a good leader if you can't trust and let go. And letting go is really hard for a perfectionist. So how are we monitoring that ability to let go and getting specific about it? But you're right. It's still progress monitoring. It's more about, are we making the right goal? And are we monitoring it in the correct measurable way?
And I think it's important also to acknowledge, since we got on this topic of perfectionism, I always say, it's kind of a maladaptive coping skill if it goes to the point of being too much. But a lot of neurodivergent people end up relying on that because it is their way to double check and triple check or make sure that they're not making these mistakes that maybe come from gaps in their executive functioning skills. And I'm wondering how you help those particular clients to step away from some of that, in order to work on the executive functioning, in order to be able to alleviate some of that pressure that they're putting on themselves with that perfectionism.
That's a great question. I think this, to me, comes down to scaffolding, because I can see where you're saying if you want it to be perfect, but yet I've worked with a lot of high achieving individuals who also have executive functioning issues. So it's creating the system, and then is the system successful? If I then become overly concerned about the system, and I'm checking 3 and 4 times a day at this calendar, even though once would do, that's when you would have to create more of a goal of like, how many times? What's the frequency of which I'm going to check this? And I think, too, it's important to point out, what is this costing me? There is a cost to every decision we make, right? Mm-hmm. So yes, I totally think double checking is okay, right? For example, I might know I'm feeling kind of stressed, and because I know all about cognitive profiles, if I'm more stressed, I'm more likely to forget. So I'm going to double check when I'm emotionally feeling this way. But also if I perseverate on that, then I have to step back and be like, what is this habit costing me, and where is it benefiting me? Because it is costing me time. And if you can make the connection for perfectionists where it's taking away from quality in other places, going back to balance, you have to make the connection as a coach about value and their values. So that's a huge reason why I kind of create these identity dashboards with my coaching clients. So it always goes back to their values. And sometimes when we're trying to shift a habit, it's like, when are we living by our values and when are we not? Mm-hmm. And how is this aligned?
As a mental health clinician, throughout my counseling program, and I'm sure that through any coaching programs as well, one of the things that we are taught basically is that when we're working with our clients, we should avoid giving advice to them. Like the goal should be to help them along that path and find those solutions that work for them without, like you said earlier, not necessarily telling them what to do. I think it can be hard for parents and sometimes even educators who may have certain ideas about how to do certain things or certain expectations for their kids. So how do you help parents find a way to move away from giving advice to something that is a bit less directive?
It's first important for the parent to understand, what is your relationship with advice? What value is it bringing you? You have to remember, I think that there is a value as humans we get from giving advice, from like knowing what to do and also saving. So what is that relationship that you have with advice? How is it serving you? That's important to be aware of. But then also I'm big on having default questions when we're trying to change a habit. So I think it's important to kind of ask when someone's sharing something with you that might seem stressful, or we could call it a problem, do you want me to listen, or are you looking for me to problem solve? That's the first thing, because you're first figuring out what the other person wants. But even then is, how can you hold yourself to asking more questions before you go into telling? because I think it's really hard, whether we're being a parent or a friend or a boss, it's hard to really fully know the context and what is authentic problem solving to that individual, because we aren't them. And that goes back to just my belief that as a coach, we believe that individuals are the most skilled in solving their own problems, but they might need some help in kind of uncovering their relationship with the problem or the situation. So that's just some of the advice as we switch over, is like, before you dive into advice, could you at least figure out if maybe someone is just wanting you to listen to them and they're just trying to vent and be heard, because no one's really going to take advice if you don't have that relationship there. And I think when we jump into advice, there's a cost, and that cost can be we're not listening as well. And sometimes if we're wrong about what the problem or the other person's feeling is, it can feel dismissive of that person's feelings or the problem.
One thing that I have found really helpful, like when I'm working with my clients or also with my own personal children, but if I'm trying to avoid giving advice, I might suggest something like, hey, let's just brainstorm some ideas. And so then they're giving some ideas, and then I have an opportunity to throw my ideas in there. But then I kind of try to push it back and say, now you can choose one of these. And a lot of times I'll tell parents, sometimes they make the wrong choice. And I know that they're making the wrong choice, but I want them to be empowered to make that choice and then to self-evaluate and say, oh, well, that didn't work. So now we can go back. And a lot of times, though, they might even realize like, oh, yeah, this is the best idea. But at least I'm not taking it away from them. It's more of a, let's come up with all of the different possibilities, and then you figure out which one you think we might be able to adapt to work best for you. And then it kind of steps away from that. I'm not telling you what to do. We're just having this conversation, and then you're taking the next step.
Right. And I think with that too, I think that's great what you said. It's important for them, even if you think it is a bad idea, is you have to let them move forward, going back to we all learn from mistakes. But I think in coaching, 2 questions that are also helpful to ask, and also that help build executive functioning skills, because flexibility and thinking are, what are possible outcomes from this action? Mm-hmm. And what might go wrong?
Yeah, trying to just anticipate some of those things and have a realistic view of it. I wanted to ask also about collaborating between home and school, because for kids who are neurodivergent, their parents are often the ones who are doing a lot of the advocacy for them, depending on what age they are. But ultimately, collaboration is just, it's a bridge that really has to be built from both sides. And so I'm wondering if you have some ideas for how parents and educators really can collaborate, or if there are some opportunities that maybe are getting missed that maybe they could look for in order to improve that area.
Yes. I just have to say, for 13 years, I spent as what I call the middle woman, if you will, between teachers and parents. I've built a bunch of essentially learning support programs in independent schools. And I think what's important is, from the school perspective, people that work at the school need to always start with the parent, and I think ask what ideas have worked at home and what hasn't worked. And I think if both parties know that we each bring things to the table, that's really, really important. I also think assuming good intentions is important. Mm-hmm. Teachers see kids in a context wildly different from home. And parents need to come in as well, right? Humbled by, what I do with my kid at home may or may not be replicable in the classroom. And so how can we come to a point with an idea share? I'm big actually on helping parents advocate, because sometimes they're afraid, right? They're going to sound like they're judging teachers. And I think it just comes back to, how can you focus on the objective data, or how will we know that this idea works? How are we going to measure? What are the specifics? I've done a lot of advocacy and IEP meetings with kids that I don't teach too. And in just asking, okay, well, did we just use one piece of data for this? None of it's judgmental if at the end of the day, everybody's about the student. And I do believe that is the case the majority of the time, is that both teachers and parents want to see their students succeed. And so going back to, it's always best to ask questions. Questions to me are rarely offensive, of course, minus tone or wherever you are at emotionally. And then I would say on both ends is it is important if, I say both sides, teacher or parent, if you're feeling like you're getting to an emotionally dysregulated place, I think it's okay to name that and want to reconvene if things become unproductive, or, hey, it feels like there's a lot of tension. I really want to get back to a productive place. Like, those are positive ways that I think either party can help control the conversation versus escalating it.
Well, Jane, I'm really grateful for your time and expertise today. But before we end our conversation, I do have just one last question for you. So if you were talking to a parent who's feeling discouraged and uncertain about the next steps to help their child, what would you tell them? What is it that you would really want them to hear?
I would tell them, I think it's important to ask your child what makes them happy and what frustrates them the most. I really think we underestimate the answers that our kids can give us. I think starting with them is always the best place. And if we're more curious, I think it will ultimately help us be able to figure out our child more often. And I think if we incorporate feedback, I think helping kids become more familiar with feedback that it's kind and it's not scary and it's just part of learning. I don't think we should veer away from feedback just because a kid is nervous about it. I think we have to show them how it helps them evolve and progress. And so that, I would say, engage in a natural reflection process as things go well and as things maybe don't work out, and be more interested in the process than the outcome.
I love that. It's so important. Jane Singleton of Launchpad for Life, thanks so much for talking to me today.
Thanks, Emily.
What's one small thing, one small skill that you'd like your child to work on? Maybe it's putting their shoes away instead of leaving them in the middle of the floor when they get home. Or maybe it's independently remembering to brush their teeth before school. Maybe you'd like them to start adding their own events to the family calendar to help with the planning and take that responsibility off your plate. Whatever the task, start small and look for the successes. Find accommodations, specifically accommodations that don't involve you. Focus on the progress, and if you or they lose steam and start to fall into those old habits, don't stress. Just regroup, see what might be able to be tweaked, and start again. Every child's brain develops on a trajectory that is all their own. But the more we meet them where they are and work toward that independence, the more empowered both they and you will feel. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Thanks to Jane Singleton. If you'd like more information about her, you will find it in the show notes. Also, there's a link to the Facebook page and group. We'd love to have you join our growing online family. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Our office manager and social media director is Krista Brown. I'm the executive producer, Dave Morris. For all of us, thank you for listening. And we'll see you next time. This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance.